Next, we'll go over the percent of receivables method. The percent of the receivables method can be done in two ways. We can use the percent of accounts receivable or an aging schedule, aging of accounts receivable. There are two steps in order to calculate the amount for the journal entry. The first one is to do an estimate of the allowance using one of these two methods. The percent of receivables would just be the same thing as percent of sales, but we'll be taking a percent of the accounts receivable account as a whole. We'll be going over the aging of accounts receivable as well coming up in a few slides. First, we'll just start really with the percent of accounts receivable because it's easier. You still follow the same steps when you get the estimate though. Use one of these methods to get the estimate of the allowance. Now, normally with the percent of the sales, we would just do the percent, that's us estimating the allowance, and then journalizing that number. We have a second step here. We have to look at the balance in the allowance for doubtful accounts account. This can be a little tricky, and I'll try my best to explain why this is. Let's just use the percent of sales method first. In 2019, we had sales of 100,000 and 2020 sales of 150,000. Let's say it's 10% that we believe is uncollectible. We'll do 10% of the 100,000 in one year and 10% of the 150,000 in the next year. These numbers are completely independent of one another. My sales of 100,000 in 2019 are not included in my sales of 2020. We're not duplicating any information when we do 10% of both these numbers. Doing 10% of this 150,000 would have nothing to do with this 100,000 here. Now let's look at the percent of accounts receivable method. In 2019, we had accounts receivable of 20,000, and in 2020, we had accounts receivable of 15,000. If we just did, let's say, 10% of each of these numbers, that would be the percent of accounts receivable for that year. However, the issue is some of this 20,000 might be included in this 15,000 here. If there's a client that owed us money in 2019, it could have carried over to 2020. Now, ideally, hopefully we'd write off these clients who have owed us money for more than a year. Let's say John Smith owed us $1,000 in 2019 and never paid us. Now it's 2020, his $1,000 that he owes us is still included in this number right here. If we did 10% of 2019 and 10% of 2020 to write off, we would be duplicating an amount. We'd be doing 10% of this one client's account, and we would be doing it again in the next year. I know this sounds a little confusing, and I'm just explaining why. If you don't really understand what I'm talking about, that's okay. Just kind of memorize the steps that we're doing. But basically, we have to look at the allowance account because we don't want to have duplicate information in there. Percent of sales, we don't have to worry about that because it's all new information, but percent of accounts receivable can carry over year after year after year, and we won't be writing off the same information over and over and over again. Therefore, when we do this method, we'll have to do the estimate of the allowance. We'll use a percent of the accounts receivable, or we'll do the aging schedule. Well, that's coming up next. And then we'll have to subtract that from the previous balance in the allowance for doubtful accounts to come up with the bad debt expense, the amount we journalize. Here's a little tip. If the balance in the allowance for doubtful accounts had a credit balance, we're going to subtract. If it had a debit balance, we're going to add the numbers together. I'll explain what this means next when we do an example because I think it might make a little bit more sense. This is problem number 4 on your classwork. We have Maisie Supply Co. who uses the percent of accounts receivable method to estimate bad debts. On December 31st, 2017, it has outstanding accounts receivable of $55,000 and it estimates that 2% will be uncollectible. Prepare the adjusting entry to record bad debts expense for the year 2017. Under the assumption that the allowance for doubtful accounts has And in Part A, it's a $415 credit balance before the adjustment. As a reminder, regardless of what method we're using, estimating the allowance is always this journal entry right here, bad debt expense and allowance for doubtful accounts. We're just trying to come up with the amount here. So first I'm just going to put these two account names in, and then we'll figure out the amount. The date is 12/31. It's the end of the year. We have the two journal entries, bad debt expense and allowance for doubtful accounts. Remember, always use these when we're estimating the allowance. Now, to come up with the amount, it's the percent of receivables. We start off the same way we did percent of sales, but we'll use percent of receivables. It's the percent we think will be uncollectible times the amount in the account. In this case, it would be the accounts receivable account. We're going to do 2% of 55,000. 55,000 times 2% equals 1,100. If this had been the percent of sales method, we would just take this amount and put that as our amount for the journal entry. However, because we're using percent of receivables method, we do have to look in the balance of the allowance for doubtful account. In this case, it was a $415 credit balance. Shown in the previous slide, if there was a credit balance, we're going to subtract the two numbers and then journalize that amount. We'll take the 1,100 minus 415. Like I said, because it's a credit balance, we're subtracting. And I'll explain why in a moment. When we subtract these two numbers, we get $685, and this is what we'll journalize. Subtract these and journalize that amount. Now for Part B, it's the same exact scenario, except there's a $291 debit in the allowance for doubtful accounts account before this. The first part still stays the same. We still do 55,000 times 2%, which equals 1,100. We will then have to look at this balance to see what the amount is that we journalize. The accounts are still the same. It is still 12/31, still a debit to bad debt expense, and still a credit for allowance for doubtful accounts. The only thing that's going to be different is the amount. We're going to take the 1,100, and because there is a debit balance in this case, we're going to add the two numbers together. 1,100 plus 291, we get 1,391. When we did 55,000 times 2% and we got 1,100, this is the amount that we want in the allowance for doubtful accounts as the balance. Because allowance for doubtful accounts is a contra receivable account, it has a credit balance. I drew T accounts to help illustrate this from Part A and Part B. This is the allowance for doubtful account, T account. We want 1,100 as our balance on the credit side because this has a credit balance. In the case of Part A, there was already a $415 credit balance in that account. We have $415 in there, but we want 1,100. Therefore, we subtract these numbers to see what we need to add to the account. In Part A, we added $685. 415 plus 685 equals 1,100. Now the balance has what we want, and we had to do this $685 credit to the allowance for doubtful accounts. In Part B, there was a $291 debit balance, basically showing it's negative, meaning that more people wrote off accounts than what we had estimated. We want an $1,100 credit balance, but we're currently negative $291. That's why I said we need to add these numbers together. We need to cover the $291 we're negative, plus an additional 1,100 to bring the account to 1,100. That's why in Part B, we had to do a credit of $1,391. a debit of 291 and a credit of 1391. Opposite sides you subtract, we get 1100. We want the balance to be 1100. Even if you don't really understand everything I'm talking about, once again, as long as you remember what to do. If there's a credit balance, you subtract your estimate from that balance. If there's a debit balance, you add it to the estimate you got, and then you would journalize that number. The last method we're going to learn is the aging of receivables method. Remember, the aging of receivables method is still done the same way of the percent of receivables method. The only difference is we're not just going to take a flat rate, like a flat percent with all the receivables. We're going to divide the receivables into different categories. We're going to classify each receivable by how long it's past due. We're under the assumption that the longer something is past due, the more likely we're not going to collect it. If someone is only maybe a month late of paying me, I can still assume that I might get that money. If someone is 6 months late in paying me, I can probably assume that I'm not going to get that. We're going to have different percentages based on how long an account is past due. The longer it's past due, the percent of it being uncollectible will increase. That's why this method is different than percent of receivables. Percent of receivables takes a whole chunk and just multiplies it by 1%. We're going to take those who aren't that late and multiply that by percent, and then those who are really late, multiply that by a different percent. Let's do a practice problem because I think it might be easier to show you how it's done by practicing this. This is number 5 on your classwork. We have daily company who estimates uncollectible accounts using the allowance method at December 31st. And prepare the following aging of receivables analysis. And in this chart here, it shows that the total amount of accounts receivable is 570,000. Under the percent of receivables method, we would just take 1% and multiply it by this 570. Instead, we're going to classify the accounts by how past due they are. For instance, this first column is those who aren't past due at all. We think maybe 1% will be bad debts, will be uncollectible. Those who are 1 day to 30 days late, we increase that a little bit, 2%, and so on, 5%, 7%. And those who are over 3 months late, we say maybe 10% will be uncollectible. We increase this the longer an account is overdue. So instead of taking 1% to the whole amount, we'll do it into categories. So for part A, you have to complete this table here to calculate the estimated balance of the allowance for doubtful accounts using the aging of receivables method. We're basically just copying the information from this first chart into this second chart and then multiplying the amount of the accounts receivable by the percent. So those not due yet, this first box would be the 0, the 396. Those are 0 days late. And the percent would be 1%. All this is done for you already. Then you would just have to calculate this amount. And please, everyone, actually do this in your calculator because I see so many students not being able to multiply percents correctly. So make sure you can do this and you're following along so you don't get it wrong on the test. 1% would be 0.01 in the calculator. When you multiply this, you get 3,960. We would do the same thing for the next line, 1 to 30 days. We look at this 1 to 30 days, 90,000 and 2%. 90,000 times 2%, we get 1,800. Do it for the remaining columns. 36,000 at 5% is 1,800 as well. 18,000 at 7% is 1,260, and 30,000 at 10% is 3,000. What we do now is add all the amounts up to give us $11,820. As a reminder, when we're using any of the receivables method, whether it's the aging of receivables or percent of receivables, we're not just going to journalize this $11,820. We need to look at what the balance is in the allowance for doubtful accounts. And that's what we're going to do here in Part B. Part B is to prepare the adjusting entry to record the bad debt expense using the estimate from Part A. Assume the unadjusted balance in the allowance for doubtful accounts is a $3,600 credit. As a reminder, $11,820 is the amount we calculate from the aging schedule. When we journalize the estimate, it's always the same. We've done this several times already. 1231 is going to be bad debt expense and the allowance for doubtful accounts. Just memorize this because we're doing this every single time. The harder part is coming up with the amount. Remember, we're not just journalizing the $11,820. We need to look at the balance in the account, which is a $3,600 credit. Remember, when there's a credit balance, we subtract. We'll take $11,820 minus the $3,600. The amount we get is $8,220. That's the amount we journalize. Part B, same situation, except the balance in allowance for doubtful accounts is a $100 debit. Once again, before we even calculate the amount, we can put in the journal entries because it's exactly the same. I do have a lot of students who always reverse this for some reason. It's exactly the same every time, regardless if it's percent of sales, percent of receivables, or aging of receivables. Doing the estimate is always the same journal entry. Now, to come up with the amount, because it's a debit, we add. We'll take the $11,820 plus $100. When we add these numbers, we get $11,920, and that's our journal entry.